I think we should move her out before winter. It'll be easier that way, Ashley whispered, and I realized in that moment they weren't talking about a plan. They were talking about me. I stood at the top of the staircase, one hand resting lightly against the banister, my breath so quiet I could barely hear it myself, the soft glow from the kitchen below spilling into the hallway like nothing had changed. Like everything was still the same house I had lived in for over 30 years, the same house where I raised my son, where I buried my husband, where every corner held a memory that used to feel warm but now felt observed, measured, evaluated. Daniel's voice came next, lower, hesitant, but not enough to stop her. We just have to time it right. Maybe after the holidays. She won't expect it then. I didn't move. I didn't gasp. I didn't even blink. I simply listened, because something inside me, something quiet and old and wiser than my emotions, told me that whatever I did next would matter more than anything I had done in years. Ashley let out a small laugh, the kind she used when she thought she was being practical. It's not like she can manage this place anymore anyway. It's too big. Too much upkeep. And honestly, Daniel, we could really use the space. The words didn't hit me all at once. They settled slowly, like dust, covering everything I thought I understood about my own life. This place. Not my home. Not the house your father and I paid off inch by inch, mortgage payment by mortgage payment, sacrificing vacations and dinners out so one day we could sit on that porch and watch the seasons change. Just space. I turned quietly and walked back to my bedroom, closing the door with the same care I used every night, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just overheard my future being rearranged like furniture in a room I no longer belonged in. The clock on my nightstand read 9:17 p.m. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded neatly in my lap, staring at the framed photograph of my husband, Thomas, smiling the way he always did, steady, reassuring, the kind of smile that used to make everything feel secure. You always said they'd take care of me, I thought, not bitterly, not even sadly, just factually, as if I were reviewing a memory instead of grieving it. Downstairs, I could still hear the faint murmur of their voices, softer now, indistinct, but I didn't need to hear the rest. I had already heard enough. What surprised me wasn't the plan itself. It was how calm I felt. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because the hurt had somewhere to go. It had direction. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the backyard, the old oak tree still standing where Daniel used to play as a boy, where Thomas built that crooked tree house one summer when we couldn't afford anything better, and for a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it all. Then I let it go. Because this wasn't the first time something hadn't added up. The quiet phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. The paperwork Daniel insisted on organizing for me last month. The way Ashley had started referring to the house as too much for you, instead of your home. Small things. Easy to dismiss. Until they weren't. I walked to my desk and opened the drawer where I kept my documents, running my fingers over the neatly stacked folders, the insurance papers, the deed, the accounts Thomas had made sure were clear, protected, understood. He had always believed in preparation. In not leaving things to chance. I used to think that was just who he was. Careful. Methodical. Now I wondered if, in some quiet way, he had known something I didn't. I closed the drawer gently and sat down, my mind already moving ahead of my emotions, already connecting pieces that had been scattered for far too long. They thought they were planning my life. They thought I wouldn't notice. And maybe, until tonight, they were right. I glanced back at the clock. 9:42 p.m. There was still time. Not to confront them. Not to argue or demand explanations that would only be softened into excuses. No. There was time to do something far more important. I reached for my phone, my fingers steady, my voice calm when I finally spoke into the quiet room. Hello, this is Margaret Collins. I need to schedule an appointment. First thing in the morning? Yes, it's about updating everything. I woke up before the sun came up, not because I had set an alarm, but because my mind had already moved ahead of the night, already rewriting things I had spent years believing were fixed, and for a few seconds I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the same hum that used to feel comforting but now felt like something waiting, something watching. As if the walls themselves knew what had been said downstairs the night before. I did not rush out of bed. I did not check my phone immediately. Instead, I followed the same routine I had followed for decades, because routine is a powerful thing. It hides intention, it keeps everything looking normal even when nothing is. I got up, folded my blanket neatly, and walked to the bathroom, turning on the light and looking at my reflection in the mirror, studying the lines on my face, the silver in my hair, not with sadness, but with a kind of clarity I had not felt in a long time. They think I am fragile, I thought, not angrily, just precisely, as if I were stating a fact. Downstairs, I could hear movement in the kitchen, the sound of a cabinet door opening, the soft clink of a coffee mug, and for a moment I paused at the top of the stairs, remembering exactly where I had been standing the night before, exactly what I had heard, and how easily they had spoken about my life as if it were a problem to be solved. This time, I walked down without hesitation. Ashley was already there, dressed in one of her usual soft sweaters, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression perfectly composed as she poured coffee into 2 mugs. She looked up and smiled the moment she saw me, warm, polite, practiced. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, sliding one of the mugs slightly across the counter, as if she had always intended it for me. I smiled back, just as calmly. "Good morning, Ashley. You are up early." Daniel joined us a moment later, still adjusting his shirt cuffs, his movements efficient, distracted, as if his mind was already somewhere else, and when he saw me, he hesitated for just a fraction of a second before leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Morning, Mom. You sleep okay?" I nodded. "Perfectly." My voice did not tremble. My hands did not shake. I picked up the mug, took a slow sip, and let the warmth settle in my chest, grounding me in the moment, reminding me that control does not come from reacting, it comes from choosing when not to. We sat together for a few minutes, the 3 of us, exchanging small talk about the weather, about errands, about nothing at all, and I watched them carefully, not obviously, not suspiciously, but the way someone watches a familiar movie after already knowing the ending, noticing the details that used to go unnoticed. The glance they exchanged when they thought I was not looking. The slight pause before answering simple questions. The way Ashley gently redirected the conversation whenever it drifted toward anything related to the house. It was all there, subtle, but no longer invisible. After breakfast, Daniel grabbed his keys and checked his watch. "I have an early meeting," he said, avoiding my eyes just long enough to confirm what I already knew. Ashley nodded. "I will be out later too," she added, her tone light, casual, as if their schedules were the only thing that mattered in this house. I set my mug down and stood up, smoothing the front of my blouse. "That sounds like a busy day," I said. "I have a few things to take care of myself." Daniel gave a quick nod, already halfway to the door. "Let me know if you need anything, Mom." I smiled again, the same gentle smile I had used for years. "Of course." I watched them leave, the front door closing with a soft click that echoed longer than it should have, and I stood there for a moment in the quiet, not feeling abandoned, not feeling lost, but feeling something else entirely, something sharper, more focused. The house was silent again, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like an opportunity. I walked back to the kitchen, rinsed my cup, and placed it carefully in the sink before heading to my room, where my purse was already waiting on the chair, exactly where I had left it the night before. I picked it up, checked that everything was inside, my identification, my documents, the small notebook, where I had written down a few key details before going to bed, and then I paused for just a second, looking around the room that had once felt like the center of my life. Not anymore, I thought. Not unless I decide it is. I turned off the light, walked out, and closed the door behind me with quiet certainty, already knowing that by the time Daniel and Ashley came back that evening, they would still believe they were in control of everything, and that would be the first real mistake they would make. I drove slowly that morning, not because the roads were busy, but because I wanted the time to think, to let each piece of the puzzle settle into place without rushing past it the way I had done for years, brushing aside small discomforts and quiet doubts in the name of keeping peace in a house that no longer felt like mine. The sky was still pale, the kind of early morning light that makes everything look softer than it really is, and for a moment I almost smiled at the familiarity of it. The same route I had taken countless times before, past the grocery store where I used to shop for Daniel's favorite meals, past the little park where he learned how to ride a bicycle, past the bank where Thomas and I once sat together, signing papers we believed would protect our future. I parked in the same lot, turned off the engine, and sat there for a few seconds longer than necessary, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, steady, certain, as if they already understood what needed to be done before my mind had fully put it into words. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to places where decisions are made every day, decisions that change lives without anyone raising their voice. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, and I returned it just as calmly, giving my name, watching the brief flicker of recognition in her eyes as she checked the schedule. "Margaret Collins," she said, as if confirming something more than just an appointment. "Please have a seat. It will be just a moment." I sat down in one of the leather chairs, smoothing my skirt the way I always did, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. And as I waited, I found myself noticing things I would have ignored before: the quiet murmur of distant conversations, the soft ticking of a clock on the wall, the way people walked in and out carrying folders that likely held their own versions of trust, hope, or sometimes regret. When my name was called, I stood up without hesitation and followed the young assistant down the hallway, each step measured, not rushed, not uncertain, just deliberate. The office itself was familiar, though I had not been there in years. The same wooden desk, the same shelves lined with neatly arranged binders, the same framed certificates that once reassured me that everything Thomas and I had planned was in good hands. Mr. Harrison stood as I entered, his expression warm but attentive, the kind of look that told me he understood more than I had yet said. "Mrs. Collins, it is good to see you again," he said, extending his hand. I shook it firmly. "It has been a while. Please have a seat." He waited until I was settled before sitting down himself, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. "What can I help you with today?" I did not hesitate. "I would like to review everything," I said, my voice even, controlled, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "My estate, my accounts, the house, all of it." His expression shifted slightly, not surprised, but focused. "Of course. We can go through each item carefully. Has something changed?" I paused for a fraction of a second, not because I was unsure, but because I was choosing my words with care. "I believe it has," I said simply. He nodded once, then reached for a folder, opening it with practiced ease, and as he began to explain the current structure of everything Thomas and I had put in place years ago, I listened more closely than I ever had before, not as a wife trusting her husband's decisions, but as a woman reclaiming her own. "The house is still solely in your name," he said, glancing up to ensure I was following. "The accounts are structured as you both agreed, with Daniel as the primary beneficiary, unless otherwise specified." I nodded slowly, letting that detail settle, feeling its weight in a way I had never allowed myself to before. "Unless otherwise specified." The phrase echoed quietly in my mind, not as a warning, but as an opening. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the desk, my posture calm, my gaze steady. "I would like to make some changes," I said, and for the first time since the night before, I felt something shift completely into place, not anger, not fear, but clarity, the kind that does not need to be spoken loudly to be understood. Mr. Harrison did not interrupt. He simply reached for a pen and a blank document, ready to write, ready to follow where I led. "Tell me what you would like to change," he said. And so I did, one decision at a time, each one precise, each one intentional, each one quietly undoing a plan that had never been mine to begin with. Mr. Harrison did not interrupt as I spoke, and that, more than anything, told me I had come to the right place, because there was no judgment in his silence, only attention, the kind that allows a person to fully step into their own decisions without being pulled backward by doubt or expectation, and as I outlined each change, carefully, clearly, I could feel something inside me steadying in a way it had not in years. As if I were finally standing on solid ground after slowly realizing the floor beneath me had been shifting for far too long. I would like the house to remain solely under my control, I said, my voice calm but firm, not rushed, not uncertain, and I would like to remove any automatic transfer of ownership that occurs without my direct authorization. He nodded once, writing it down, his pen moving smoothly across the page. And the accounts? He asked, glancing up briefly. I folded my hands together on the desk, considering for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to say it exactly as I meant it. I would like to restructure them, I said, ensuring that no one has access without my explicit approval, and that any distributions are conditional, based on my decisions, not assumptions. Again, he nodded, making notes, asking a few precise questions that helped shape everything into something clear, something enforceable, something real. As we continued, I realized how much I had trusted things to remain as they were simply because they had always been that way, how easily routine becomes a substitute for awareness, and how quietly that can be used against you without you ever noticing until it is almost too late. Almost. When we reached the final document, he set the pen down for a moment, and looked at me more directly. These are significant changes, Mrs. Collins, he said, not as a warning, but as a confirmation. Are you certain this reflects your intentions? I met his gaze without hesitation. Completely. He held my eyes for a second longer, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something beyond the paperwork itself, something about the person sitting across from him. Very well. He turned the document toward me, indicating where I needed to sign, and I picked up the pen, feeling its weight in my hand, not heavy, not dramatic, just present, real, and as I signed my name, carefully, deliberately, I felt something settle into place, something final, not an ending, but a shift, quiet and absolute. When it was done, he gathered the papers and placed them neatly into a folder, securing everything with the kind of precision that left no room for interpretation. I will have these processed immediately, he said. Everything will be updated by the end of the day. I stood up, smoothing my jacket, and offered a small, polite smile. Thank you. As I walked out of the office, the hallway felt different than it had when I entered, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had, and the difference was subtle, almost invisible, but undeniable. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, the morning giving way to midday, and I took a slow breath, letting it fill my lungs, grounding myself in the present, not the past, not the version of my life someone else had been planning for me, but the one I had just taken back piece by piece. I drove home the same way I had come, past the same streets, the same stores, the same familiar landmarks, but this time I noticed something else, something I had not allowed myself to see before, that everything I thought I might lose was not something that could simply be taken, not if I chose to hold it differently. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same, unchanged, quiet, waiting, and I sat there for a moment, looking at it not as something fragile, not as something at risk, but as something that belonged exactly where it was, exactly as it was, because I had decided it would. Inside, everything was still, the clock ticking softly in the hallway, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air, and I moved through each room slowly, not to check anything, not to search, but simply to feel the space again, to remind myself that nothing had been lost, not yet, and not anymore without my consent. By the time I reached the living room, the sun had shifted just enough to cast long shadows across the floor, and I stood there quietly, knowing that when Daniel and Ashley walked through that door later, they would see the same house, the same routine, the same version of me they had grown comfortable underestimating, and I would let them, because sometimes the most powerful position is the one no one realizes you have already claimed. They came home later than usual that evening, just after 6:30. The sound of the front door opening followed by the familiar rhythm of footsteps I had known for years, and I was already in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a dish towel in my hands, drying a plate that did not need drying, moving slowly, deliberately, as if nothing in the world had shifted since the night before. Ashley was the first to walk in, her voice light as she set her bag down on the chair. It smells nice in here, she said, glancing around as if she expected everything to be exactly where she had left it, and in a way, it was. Daniel followed, loosening his tie, his expression tired but controlled, the same look he used when he wanted to appear unaffected by anything outside of his own plans. Hey, Mom, he said, stepping into the kitchen. You have been busy. I turned slightly, offering a small smile, not too warm, not too distant, just enough to keep everything comfortable. I had a quiet day, I said, placing the plate back into the cabinet with a soft click. I thought I would make something simple for dinner. Ashley nodded, already moving to check her phone, her attention drifting in the way it always did when she believed there was nothing she needed to manage. That sounds perfect, she said. We have both had long days. I watched them for a moment, not obviously, just enough to notice the way they settled into the space, the ease in their movements, the quiet confidence of people who believe they understand exactly how things are going to unfold. It was almost impressive, how natural it all looked, how easily they carried on as if the future had already been decided, as if I were simply a part of the furniture that needed to be rearranged at the right time. Dinner was quiet, polite, filled with small conversations that did not go anywhere, questions about errands, about schedules, about things that did not matter, and I answered them the same way I always had, calmly, without hesitation, without revealing anything beyond what they expected to hear. At one point, Ashley glanced at Daniel, just for a second, a quick exchange that would have meant nothing to me a week ago, but now it stood out clearly, like a signal passed between two people who believed no one else was paying attention. I continued eating, setting my fork down neatly between each bite, letting the silence stretch just enough to make them fill it with words they did not need to say. After dinner, Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. We should probably start thinking about the next few months, he said casually, as if the idea had just come to him, as if it were not something I had already heard them plan in detail. Ashley nodded immediately, her tone thoughtful, careful. Yes, especially with winter coming. It might be a good time to simplify things a bit. I looked at them both, just long enough to acknowledge the conversation, then reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip before setting it down again. That sounds like something worth considering, I said, my voice steady, agreeable, giving them exactly what they expected without offering anything more. Daniel seemed relieved, though he tried not to show it, and Ashley smiled slightly, as if a small step had just gone according to plan. The conversation moved on. After that, drifting into safer topics, but the intention remained in the air, quiet, patient, waiting for the right moment to be pushed further. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the house had settled into its usual stillness, I sat in the living room with a book open in my lap, though I was not reading it, listening instead to the faint sounds of movement upstairs, the closing of doors, the soft murmur of voices that did not carry far enough to be understood, and I realized something that made me almost smile, not out of amusement, but out of certainty. They were waiting for the right moment. They believed timing was everything. What they did not understand was that timing had already passed them by. I closed the book gently and placed it on the table beside me, the quiet click echoing softly in the room, and as I sat there in the dim light, I felt no urgency, no fear, only a calm awareness that whatever they planned to do next would no longer unfold the way they expected, because the version of me they had been planning around no longer existed, and they had not even noticed when she disappeared. The next morning unfolded the same way as the one before, quiet, measured, almost predictable, and that predictability was exactly what I needed, because it allowed me to move through the house without drawing attention, without creating the kind of disruption that would make Daniel or Ashley pause and look closer, and I had no intention of giving them that advantage. I woke before they did, made my coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a small notepad in front of me, not writing anything at first, just looking at the blank page, letting my thoughts settle into something more structured, something useful. There was a time when I would have filled that page with questions, with doubts, with reasons to explain away what I had heard, but that time had passed, and now there was only one thing left to do: understand exactly how far their plans had gone. When Ashley came downstairs, she greeted me with the same soft smile, the same gentle tone that had once made me believe she was simply trying to fit into this family, and I returned it just as naturally, asking about her day, listening to her answer, watching the way she chose her words carefully, as if she were always just slightly aware that something needed to be managed. Daniel joined us shortly after, and the morning conversation followed its usual rhythm, light, uneventful, filled with small details that did not matter, and I played my part without hesitation, because sometimes the most effective way to learn the truth is to let others believe they are not being observed. After they left, I did not wait. I moved directly to the study, closing the door behind me with quiet precision, and for a moment I stood there, looking at the desk where Thomas used to sit, the same desk Daniel had started using more frequently over the past few months under the explanation that he was helping me stay organized. At the time, I had been grateful. Now, I was curious. I sat down and opened the top drawer, finding it exactly as Daniel had arranged it, folders labeled neatly, documents stacked in careful order, everything appearing clean, efficient, harmless. But appearances are often the most convenient disguise. I began to go through each folder slowly, not rushing, not skipping anything, reading every page, every note, every small detail that might have once seemed insignificant but now felt like part of something larger. It did not take long before I noticed the first inconsistency, a document that had been copied, not original, a signature line that felt too recent, too carefully placed, and as I continued, the pattern became clearer, subtle adjustments, small shifts, nothing dramatic enough to raise alarm on its own, but together they formed something unmistakable, a quiet preparation. A structure being built around me without my full awareness. I leaned back slightly, letting the information settle, not reacting, not allowing frustration to cloud what I was beginning to see with clarity. This was not impulsive. This was planned. Carefully, patiently, over time. I closed the folder and placed it back exactly where I had found it, aligning the edges so nothing appeared disturbed, then moved on to the next drawer, checking what had been added, what had been moved, what no longer matched what I remembered. Each discovery was small, controlled, but together they confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that this was never about helping me. It was about positioning themselves in a way that would make their next move seem natural, even reasonable. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard, the same oak tree standing quietly in the distance, unchanged, steady, and I found myself thinking about how easily trust can be reshaped when it is not actively protected. For years, I had believed that love and familiarity were enough, that shared history would keep everything in place. But now I understood something different, something far more important. Trust is not permanent. It is maintained. And when it is not, it becomes something else entirely. I turned back to the desk, took one last look at the room, and then walked out, closing the door gently behind me, my mind no longer searching for answers, but organizing them, placing each piece exactly where it belonged, because now that I knew what they had been building, I also knew exactly how to dismantle it, quietly, completely, and in a way they would never see coming until it was already done. That afternoon, I did not sit down or rest the way I normally would, not because I felt rushed, but because something inside me had shifted from reflection to action, and once that shift happens, there is no returning to stillness, only movement, quiet, controlled, but purposeful in a way that changes everything beneath the surface. I moved through the house again, slower this time, not searching for anything new, but confirming what I had already discovered, making sure every detail remained exactly where it had been, every folder aligned, every drawer closed just enough to appear untouched, because the success of what came next depended not on what I revealed, but on what I allowed them to continue believing. By late afternoon, I had everything I needed, not just the documents, not just the patterns, but the understanding of how they thought, how they approached decisions, how they relied on the assumption that I would remain passive, grateful, unaware. That assumption was the foundation of their plan, and it was also the weakest part of it. When Daniel and Ashley returned that evening, nothing in my behavior changed. I greeted them the same way, asked about their day, listened without interruption, nodded at the appropriate moments, and watched carefully as they settled into their routine, comfortable, confident, still unaware that the structure they had been building was already beginning to shift beneath them. At dinner, Ashley spoke about a friend who had recently moved into a smaller place, mentioning how much easier life had become for her, how freeing it was not to worry about maintenance or space, and Daniel added a few comments about how people sometimes hold on to things longer than they should, his tone casual, almost thoughtful, as if he were speaking in general terms rather than guiding the conversation toward a specific outcome. I responded with interest, asking a few light questions, allowing them to expand on the idea without resistance, because resistance would have slowed them down, and I needed them to keep moving forward exactly as they intended. After dinner, I excused myself earlier than usual, not out of fatigue, but because I had something else to do, something that required complete focus, and once I was in my room, with the door closed and the house quiet around me, I sat at the small desk by the window and opened my notebook, reviewing the notes I had written, each point clear, precise, connected to the decisions I had already put into motion that morning. This was no longer about reacting. It was about control. I picked up my phone and made 2 more calls, both brief, both direct, confirming details, setting timelines, ensuring that every change I had initiated would be reinforced from multiple directions, not leaving anything to chance, not allowing any part of their plan to remain intact simply because I had overlooked it. When I finished, I placed the phone down and sat there for a moment, looking out into the darkening yard, the outline of the oak tree barely visible now, steady and unmoved by anything happening inside the house, and I realized how much strength there is in quiet preparation, in choosing not to confront immediately, not to reveal knowledge too early, but to build something stronger underneath, something that cannot be undone with words or explanations. Upstairs, I could hear faint movement again, the low sound of voices, the rhythm of a conversation that likely continued to revolve around timing, around strategy, around what they believed would happen next, and I almost felt a sense of calm at how predictable it all was. They believed they were waiting for the right moment. They believed they were still in control of the timeline. But what they did not understand, what they had completely missed, was that the moment had already passed them by the second I decided to stop being part of their plan and start creating my own, and by the time they were ready to act, there would be nothing left for them to act on, nothing left to rearrange, nothing left to take, because everything that mattered had already been moved beyond their reach, quietly, carefully, overnight in ways they would not fully understand until it was far too late to change anything at all. The next day began with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself was waiting to see what would happen next, and I moved through it with the same quiet precision I had carried for the past 2 days, aware of every sound, every movement, every glance that might reveal more than words ever could. Daniel left earlier than usual, barely finishing his coffee before checking his watch and heading out, his mind clearly elsewhere, while Ashley lingered just a little longer, standing by the counter, stirring her cup long after the coffee had settled, her eyes drifting toward me in brief, measured looks that told me she was preparing for something, though she had not yet decided when to say it. I gave her nothing to work with, no hesitation, no curiosity, no sign that anything had changed, because sometimes silence is not just protection, it is strategy. After she finally left, the house returned to its familiar quiet, and I did not waste the time. I walked into the study again, but this time I did not search or question, because there was nothing left to confirm. Instead, I sat at the desk and opened my notebook, reviewing the final steps I had outlined the night before, each one simple on its own, but together forming something complete, something that would hold even if they tried to adjust their plans at the last moment. By midday, I had made the last call I needed, confirming that every document had been processed, every account secured, every condition clearly defined in a way that left no room for interpretation or quiet manipulation, and when I hung up the phone, I did not feel relief, I felt certainty, the kind that does not depend on what anyone else says or does. The afternoon passed slowly, but not uneasily, and when I prepared dinner that evening, I did it with the same care I always had, setting the table, arranging everything neatly, allowing the scene to remain exactly as they expected, because the strength of what I had done did not need to be visible to be real. When they came home, I noticed it immediately, a slight tension in the air, a shared awareness between them that something needed to be addressed, and this time, they did not wait long. We sat down to eat, the usual quiet settling over the table, but it did not last. "Margaret," Daniel began, his tone careful, rehearsed in a way that made it almost sound thoughtful. "There is something Ashley and I have been wanting to talk to you about." I looked up at him, meeting his eyes without hesitation, then shifted my gaze briefly to Ashley, who nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. "Of course," I said, my voice calm, inviting, leaving no trace of resistance. He took a small breath, then leaned forward slightly, as if positioning himself for a conversation he believed would shape everything that came next. "We have been thinking about what might be best for you moving forward," he said, choosing each word with care, "and especially with winter coming, we thought it might be a good time to consider some changes that could make things easier for you." Ashley added softly, her tone warm, supportive, the same tone she had always used when presenting something she wanted to sound like a kindness. "There are some wonderful places," she said, smaller, more manageable, with people your age, activities, support, everything designed to make life more comfortable. I listened without interrupting, letting their words settle into the space between us, not reacting, not questioning, simply allowing them to say everything they had planned to say, because there is power in letting people reveal the full extent of their intentions without interference. When they finished, there was a brief silence, the kind that usually signals expectation, the moment where they believed I would respond with hesitation, with uncertainty, perhaps even with gratitude for their concern. Instead, I reached for my glass, took a slow sip of water, and set it back down carefully before speaking. "That is certainly something to think about," I said, my tone steady, neutral, giving them exactly enough to believe they were still guiding the conversation. Daniel seemed to relax slightly, and Ashley's shoulders softened, both of them reading my response as agreement, or at least as openness, and they began to talk again, discussing options, timelines, possibilities, building their plan out loud as if it were already unfolding exactly as they intended. I nodded occasionally, asking a question here and there, not to challenge them, but to encourage them, to let them expand on their expectations, because every detail they shared confirmed something important, that they had no idea how much had already changed, no idea that while they were carefully outlining my future, the foundation they were relying on had already been removed, and by the time they realized it, there would be nothing left for them to adjust, nothing left for them to claim, nothing left for them to control at all. The next morning, I woke up at the same time as always, the light just beginning to slip through the curtains, soft and steady, as if nothing in the world had changed, and for a moment I simply lay there, listening to the quiet of the house, knowing that by the end of the day, everything they believed would begin to unravel in ways they had not prepared for. I moved through my routine without hesitation, dressed carefully, chose a simple blouse, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would signal anything unusual, because what was about to happen did not require drama, it required clarity. When I stepped into the kitchen, Ashley was already there, her movements slightly quicker than usual, her tone a little too bright when she greeted me, as if she were trying to maintain control over something she could not quite define. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, her smile practiced steady. I returned it easily. "Good morning." Daniel joined us shortly after, and there was a subtle shift between them, something unspoken, something shared, and I could see it now with complete certainty, the expectation, the quiet confidence that today would be the day they moved forward with what they had planned. We sat down together, and for a few minutes, everything remained normal, the same small talk, the same familiar rhythm, until Daniel finally set his cup down and cleared his throat. "Mom," he began, his tone measured, careful, as if rehearsed once again, "Ashley and I have been thinking more about what we talked about last night, and we really believe it is time to start making some decisions." I looked at him calmly, giving him my full attention. "I understand," I said, my voice even, leaving no trace of resistance or surprise. He nodded, encouraged, and continued. "We have already started looking into a few places, somewhere comfortable, somewhere you would be well taken care of, and we can handle everything here, the house, the paperwork, all of it." Ashley added softly, her voice gentle, persuasive. We just want what is best for you. I let a brief silence settle between us, not long enough to create tension, but long enough to allow their words to fully exist in the space, and then I stood up slowly, reaching for my purse that I had placed beside the chair earlier that morning. "That is very thoughtful of you," I said, my tone calm, appreciative in a way that felt natural, and I could see the relief in their expressions, the way their shoulders eased, the way they believed this conversation was going exactly as they had expected. "There is just one thing," I added, turning slightly toward them. "I took care of everything yesterday." The shift was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion alone, but from something deeper, something beginning to slip out of place. Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean, Mom?" I met his eyes directly, not unkindly, not harshly, just clearly. "I mean that everything you are concerned about has already been handled. The house, the accounts, all of it." Ashley's expression tightened just for a moment before she smoothed it over, her voice careful when she spoke again. "I am not sure I understand." I nodded once, as if acknowledging the question, then reached into my purse and placed the folder gently on the table, not pushing it toward them, not presenting it dramatically, just setting it there as something that simply existed, something real that did not need explanation to be understood. "I reviewed everything with my attorney yesterday," I said, my voice steady, composed. "The house remains under my control, and all financial decisions will be made solely by me, now and in the future." Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression shifting from confusion to something more uncertain, something that had not been part of his expectations. "But Mom," he began, stopping himself as if searching for the right words, "this is about making things easier for you." I gave a small, calm smile, the kind that does not challenge, but does not yield either. "I know exactly what this is about," I said quietly, and for the first time, there was no need to hide that understanding, no need to soften it or redirect it. Ashley's gaze moved quickly between us, her composure beginning to fracture at the edges, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that the certainty she had carried was no longer there. "You should have talked to us first," she said, her tone controlled but strained. I held her gaze evenly. "You already talked about it," I replied, not raising my voice, not adding anything more, because the truth did not need emphasis. The silence that followed was different from any before, not filled with expectation, but with realization, the slow, quiet recognition that something they had carefully planned was no longer within their reach. I picked up my purse again, adjusting the strap on my shoulder, and looked at them both one last time, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a clarity that had taken me years to find. "I will continue living here," I said simply, "and I will make my own decisions." There was nothing left to explain. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my steps steady, unhurried, leaving them sitting there with a plan that no longer existed, and as I reached the hallway, I realized that for the first time in a long time, the house felt exactly the way it was meant to feel, not controlled, not managed, but mine, entirely and without question.